All right, friends, welcome. Thank you for coming tonight to think about the book of Revelation. Everybody's probably got some kind of history with this book, or none at all. I thought I would begin by telling my history with the book of Revelation. Growing up, I'm sure I didn't know anything at all about it. When I was in college, it's this long story. I had a couple of years where I was total heathen, never thought about church, God, anything else. And then I fell in with some pretty evangelical Christians that I liked a lot. They were real warm and friendly, and they helped me. They're the reason that I'm here, actually. And but they were pretty interesting, though, in that they were big on the second coming of Jesus. And this was in the 70s. And this is when Howell had written a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. It was like the best-selling nonfiction book of the decade. I mean, this is amazing, right? And so I read all these Bible prophecies that talked about that Jesus was going to come again soon. And so the people that I hung out with, they read all this, and they assured me, and some of you will have heard this story before, so be patient. They assured me that you can't know the exact time of Jesus coming, but it would be sometime in August of 1975. You can't know the exact time. Well, this seemed just kind of nonsense to me. So I was with my roommates in my apartment one night, and it was September the 1st. And I made the comment, I said, well, I guess Jesus didn't come back. And a guy, Tom, said, how would you know? So, right, because the idea is Jesus comes back to get the holy and the faithful, and the others are left behind, right? We thought, oh, great. So we decided to conduct a little test. We thought of all the people we know, if Jesus came back and got somebody, who would it be? And so we thought about a woman that we knew. She was very holy, prayerful, sang in the choir at church. We'd not seen her for a couple of weeks. She fit the bill. So we drove out to her house, and when we got there, her car was in the driveway, and we went up to the door. We could hear music playing inside. She was a musician, and so we rang the doorbell. Nothing. Knocked on the door. Nothing. So kind of silently, we turned, went back to get in the car. And just as I lay my hand to open the car door, Glo had been out in the backyard of her house. And she spotted us. She said, hey, guys. And there she was. The funny thing about that is out of the four of us, three of us are now Methodist clergy. It's sort of interesting. At the time, though, what's interesting is people read The Late Great Planet Earth, and they hadn't actually read the book of Revelation. That's actually interesting, right? A lot of times that happens. We read The Shack or read some book, but we don't actually read the Bible. So I remember the time I thought, I shall read the book of Revelation, and I tried, it made no sense at all. I just didn't get it. So I sort of gave up on that for a while. Well, then, through odd set of circumstances, I wound up in seminary, and this guy, James Charlesworth, was offering a course on the book of Revelation. We were going to read it in Greek and all this, so I was excited about it, and it was just so eye-opening for me. I learned all this stuff about history and ancient symbolism and all that I just had never known before. So anyway, so I've been interested in it ever since then, and a lot of people are, and so just want to talk about it some tonight. The Greek title of the book, Revelation, is Apocalypsis, they would say in Greek, and this is where we get the word apocalyptic. And we have all this kind of apocalyptic stuff in our day, right? Like there are like post-apocalyptic novels and TV shows, and you have zombies and everything else in the world. There's some obsession that people seem to have with sort of the end of time or these really dark days at the end of time when the whole world falls apart. There's some cultural obsession with this. The Greek word apocalypsis, though, doesn't mean any of that. The Greek word apocalypsis simply means an uncovering, an unveiling. The idea is sort of like God's plan for the world, God's truth, the ultimate reality that is God. It's been covered up, like you've missed it. But with this book, it's unveiled. The curtain is drawn back, and we now can see the truth about what God's up to. So the very beginning of the book tells us some pretty good clues about what it's about. So I'll just read a little bit to you. So it is the revelation, apocalypsis, the uncovering, the unveiling of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. Well, there's a little clue right there that maybe the book isn't predicting what was going to happen in August of 1975, right? It's what must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John, and we don't know, by the way, which John this is. You want to say it was John, Jesus' beloved disciple, or you want to say it's John who, we don't know which John. John was the most common name in the Judeo-Christian world in those days. There were a lot of Johns, right? His angels to a servant John. Blessed is he, this is really fascinating. Blessed is he who reads aloud these words, and blessed are those who hear. If you think early church, nobody owned books. Very few people were literate. Even if you were literate, you couldn't afford books. So if you heard anything, if anything was read, you heard it read. So the early Christians would gather and they would hear the book of Revelation read aloud to them. I sat through this one time. A group decided to test this out. So somebody stood up and read the book of Revelation out loud to a group that had gathered in seminary for just this purpose. That was really hard to follow for two reasons. One, it's a complex book with really intricate symbolism that sort of is lost on us. The other reason that's hard is that you and I are not very good listeners, right? Did you hear me say that? You and I are not. We have very short attention spans, so the idea of somebody talking for an extended period of time, you being able to track it, that we have commercial breaks, and we have sound bites, and a tweet is about all that we can manage. In those days, people could listen to extended sessions of reading, and they could absorb it. They're not smarter than we are, just using portions of the brain that we haven't used. The first beginning of the book continues. We're not going to read the whole book this way, don't worry. John to these 7 churches in Asia. And we can plot all these on a map. Some of you who are with me tonight are going with me to Turkey on April the 19th. We're going to visit all 7 of those churches to which this letter is addressed. That's really interesting, right? So much of the Bible, we think Bible was written for us. So much of the New Testament was written for specific Christians in specific churches that were really struggling. There might be 20 Christians in a town. That was the church. They met in somebody's home. So this is a letter to 7 of those churches. And we're pretty sure it was designed to be an encyclical. That is, it was written to be circulated among those 7 churches, so they would read it in Colossae, and then a runner would take it down the road, and they would read it in Laodicea, and they would take it further down the road, and they would read it in Ephesus. Those churches had a sense of connection with one another. John to the 7 churches in Asia, grace and peace from him who is and who was and who is to come, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness. The word witness in Greek is really interesting. It's martus, from which we get the word martyr. Martyrdom is a big thing in these days. Christians are losing their lives for following Jesus, who what? Lost his life for the life witness that he gave to God. He's the firstborn from the dead, the ruler of the kings of the earth. To him who loves us and has freed us from sin by his blood, behold, he is coming. This is a book that is obsessed with the crucified Jesus. And we'll say more about why later. I, John, again, we don't know which John, your brother, who share with you in Jesus the tribulation. So these early Christians are undergoing what he called tribulation, a very difficult time. We'll talk more about that later. I was on the island of Patmos. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. What does that mean? He was especially inspired. He was in some kind of trance. We don't know. And I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. You already see in Revelation, it never says, I heard a trumpet. It's, I heard a voice that was like a trumpet. There's a lot of like. There's a lot of as. Words fail us when we try to describe the realities of God. It's too great. So you say, well, it's like this, or it was something like that. We'll say more about that. A voice like a trumpet saying, write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches. So John is on this island of Patmos, which is right off the coast of Turkey. Beautiful place, difficult to get to, takes a day to get there, a day to get back. John is on this island. We don't know why he's on this island. Has he been exiled there from the mainland for political difficulties of some kind? Was he one of the early Christians who was exiled off the mainland out of the cities? We don't know that. That's sheer guesswork. So John is there, and he hears what God says, the voice like a trumpet, and he writes it on a piece of parchment, then it gets circulated to those 7 churches. Now, the very first thing that John hears, this is a clue of what is to come. He says, this is so interesting. I turned to see the voice. Can you see a voice? Right? It's something you hear, it's something you see, it's kind of beyond hearing and seeing. And I saw 7 golden lampstands, and one like a son of man clothed with a long robe, his hair white as wool, his eyes a flame of fire. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth issued a... This is not like anything you've ever quite seen, right? You didn't see that downtown today, right? From his mouth issued a 2-edged sword. I fell at his feet as though dead, but he laid his hand on me, saying, "Fear not." Now, artists, they always try to draw these things, right? So here he is. He's got the sword coming out of his mouth. He's got the stars in his hand. There's 7 golden lampstands. So the artist, on the one hand, is trying his best to be faithful to what Scripture says, and in the very process misses the point of what Scripture is saying, right? Because it's not intended to be literal. It is symbolic. It is a metaphor. Nobody has a sword coming out of their mouth. You couldn't hold 5 stars in your hand. Why? I mean, a star is like our sun or brighter and hotter. So it's an image of something. It's not literal. It's an image that is evocative of something. The 7 lampstands are symbolic of these 7 churches. And we're going to visit each one just briefly here. First of all, the city of Ephesus. It's named first in Revelation. It probably was the dominant city in Asia in those days, and that's why John mentioned it first. On the left, you can see the famous library at Ephesus. That is my daughter Grace when she was, help me, Lisa, 10 years old maybe. Took her there. It was fun. The theater at Ephesus. The real spectacular site in Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was the temple to Artemis. This is what remains now of the temple of Artemis. There's one column out there. Once upon a time, it would have looked like this. In Istanbul, there's a park, and somebody built a replica of what the temple of Artemis would have looked like. And so the Christians would have not worshiped in this temple of Artemis, because the temple of Artemis is dedicated to the goddess Artemis, right? And the other awkward thing for the Christians in Ephesus, and I mentioned this in my Paul class, is that temples in the ancient world were not just places of worship. They were banks. They were the depositories of legal records. They were where business deals were struck. And so Christians refused to go into such places because they were dedicated to the worship of gods that are not gods at all. So if you made this decision to be a Christian in Ephesus, you can imagine, this cost you money. This cost you business opportunities. You probably suffered ridicule because everybody else is going into the temple. That's where the coolest of all cool things are being done. We read in Acts chapter 19 that Paul taught in a lecture hall of someone named Tyrannus day after day when he had been there. Revelation's written after Paul. That font is so little. I apologize for that. So in this letter to Ephesus, John, the writer of Revelation, says, "I know your works." The book of Revelation is a book in which your works matter. Revelation never says you are saved by grace. It says what you do matters. You need to be holy. You need to serve God. You need to be faithful to God. Holiness matters. Second thing that it says to the people in Ephesus is, you have abandoned the love that you had at first. This is really interesting. Evidently, when Christianity began in Ephesus, what people would have said is, we love the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, something happens to Christians over time, and it clearly had happened to the Christians at Ephesus. Whereas once upon a time, they would have said, we love the Lord Jesus Christ. That love has grown weak or has sort of flamed out. Now they're sort of going through the motions. Maybe they're kind of doing whatever they're doing, but they don't really think about love for Jesus any longer. Once in a while, I have the privilege of meeting somebody who's like a new excited Christian somewhere, and it always sort of puts you in the shade, right? It's like, oh, we go to church, we pay our money, we do this. And you see someone there, they've fallen in love with God. Revelation is concerned about this among the Christians in Ephesus. It says, those who practiced magic arts brought their books and burned them. So once upon a time, there were people who practiced magic in Ephesus, but they came and they burned their magical books, and they didn't do that any longer. And this reminds me of a story that a few of you will remember. Years ago, our family was on vacation in Great Britain, and we're on a train going to London one day. And it's at that point that the family's just had it with the trip. You know, like Lisa's exhausted, the kids are exhausted. I'm trying to keep everybody's attention up, so I'm quizzing my children on things like, you know, can you repeat the Gettysburg Address? They're like, no. what can you count to 10 in Spanish? And they're just not cooperating with me at all. So I decided to give them an easy one. I say, can you name the books of the Bible? Well, there's a guy across the aisle from me, and his eyes just light up when I say this. And if you're a minister and you're traveling, I just hate to say it, you often don't want to get into it with people, right? But the books of the Bible, so my kids kind of try Genesis, Exodus, and then that sort of peters out. So this guy he's interested in this, and he says, he's got this hackneyed accent. He says, "Are you a Christian man?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "What kind of a Christian are you?" Which is a great question, right? I started to say, a tepid Christian, a vacationing Christian. I don't know what to say. So I said, "Well, I'm Methodist." And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And I said, "Why are you sorry?" He said, "Well, where I come from, Methodists, they just kind of go through the motions. They're not really into this thing too much." I said, "We don't have that problem where I'm from. We're deadly serious about Jesus at all times." So I got to talking to him, and it turned out that he was a gypsy. How many of you have ever talked to a gypsy in your life? Here's like a real live gypsy. And he starts telling me about the gypsy church. So all these gypsies in Europe, which is largely becoming less and less Christian, are converting to Christianity. And they have a huge growth among gypsies of Christianity. It's an amazing thing. And so he had this book with a little boy. I thought he was teaching the little boy how to read. No, he was learning how to read. Gypsies don't read. He's learning to read. Why? He's training to be a gypsy Christian minister. This is amazing. And so I said, "You got to tell me more about this." So he said, "It's hard to be a gypsy and a Christian." And he said, one of the reasons is the number one occupation among gypsies is what? Fortune teller. And he said, when you become a Christian, you can't be a fortune teller any longer. And I thought, you just pretend, right? But he said, you can't pretend. You can't be a fortune teller any longer. That made me wonder about what professions maybe Christians here maybe shouldn't be involved in, but fortune makers, I don't know what the right answer is to that. Anyway, he just kept narrating all of this, and I was just blown away with it. And I thought about it again when I thought of Ephesus. There were people that they practiced something for a living, but they burned their books when they came to believe in Jesus. It was a radical change. And then he says, "To him who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God." So you hear this language like the tree of life, the paradise. Of course, in Genesis, we have the story of the tree of life, and Adam and Eve eat from the fruit, and that leads to their downfall. And in Ephesus, there was a garden that was called a paradise. It's called Ortygia today. We're going to visit this grove of trees. It's where the goddess Artemis was supposed to have been born. So this gets to be really interesting, isn't it? Like, you're going to eat of the tree of life. So the tree of life was the downfall for Adam and Eve. These trees were the birthplace of Artemis, but then, of course, what John, the writer of Revelation, has in mind is not just the fall in Genesis, but actually this other tree. Jesus is crucified on a tree. So it takes an image that's a negative image, and it spins it in a positive way for us. And he says, to the one who conquers, these reliefs have been found all over Ephesus, and in fact, over most of Turkey. The goddess Nike. That's cool, like Nike, right? So it's like an early swoosh there, you see. And Nike is the goddess of victory. And victory was the big thing. You try to be victorious over your foes. You try to be victorious at the Olympic Games that were traveling about. It was victory. The second letter is to the church at Smyrna. It's so fascinating. John says, I know your poverty, but you are rich. We know that Smyrna in those days was a very wealthy city. You have wealthy people, but they're really poor. This is a common theme throughout Scripture, right? Is that you have external wealth, but inside you're poor. Do not fear what you are about to suffer, for I will give you the crown of life. It's everywhere in this book, suffering has begun and is on the way and is about to get worse, and we'll say more about why. I know your tribulation. This is the kind of thing that is horrifying to read in your Bible. We just have to own that it's in there. I know your tribulation, the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. I'm really glad my friend Rabbi Murray Ezring isn't here tonight, although he's aware of this. You know, what John is saying is that the Christians are now the true Jews So the Jews who didn't convert to Christianity are the ones who say they are Jews, but they're not because they don't believe in Jesus the Messiah. And what does he have to say about Jews who don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah? They are a synagogue of Satan. We just have to own the fact that in the Bible we have the seeds of anti-Semitism. And this got seized on through the Middle Ages and the Crusades. People began slaughtering Jews. Germans in the 1930s, they picked up their Bibles and said, these Jews in our midst are part of the synagogue of Satan. They must be exterminated and killed. It's in our own Bible. This raises questions about what do we mean by the inspiration of the Bible. We talk about that more another day. Smyrna became interesting. One of the early Christian martyrs in the 2nd century was a guy named Polycarp. He is asked on the point of being burnt to death, do you believe in Christ? And he says, for 86 years I've been a Christian. Christ has done me no wrong. How could I turn on him now? And so he's burned at the stake. In the 17th century, there was a Jewish Messiah who came out of the city of Smyrna, of all things, named Sabbatai Zevi, and he started a revolutionary movement. And he wound up being killed. All kinds of interesting things. The city of Pergamum is the next one. John writes to the Christians at Pergamum. This is the theater at Pergamum. It's an absolutely beautiful city. What we find at Pergamum is in those days, as in all Roman cities, but there are great remains of it now, is temples were erected to the emperor. The emperor was regarded as divine. The emperor was called Lord. All these things that we say about Jesus were said of the emperor. So here's what John has to say, the Christians in Pergamum, where there are temples to the Roman emperor. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. Now, John pulls no punches, right? He's not really nice about this. He would say that this Roman emperor worship is of Satan. Strong statement. You eat food that is sacrificed to idols and practice immorality. So evidently the Christians in Pergamum did go to the temples dedicated to other gods. And John is calling them out on this. But to him who is conquered, I will give some of the hidden manna. I will give him a white stone. All this imagery, we have no idea what this means, but there are all these Jewish traditions about when the temple fell in the 6th century, Jeremiah took some of the manna that had been saved from the wilderness and hid it beneath the temple, and it would be found in the last days when the Messiah comes, so people once again eat this hidden manna. All these wonderful images. The city of Thyatira, the statement that, I'm going to let Lisa is here. Thank you. I brought the wrong Bible tonight. And she went home and got my right Bible. Thank you. I'm lost without it. Sorry. So the church at Thyatira, he makes this interesting accusation of them that they are like a Jezebel. If you remember the story in the Old Testament, Jezebel is the wicked queen who worships the god Baal. These traditions don't die anytime soon. So again, they are worshiping other gods, even though they are early. And you have to imagine it's very difficult for the first Christians, right? They don't really have Bibles yet. Everything that they know is passed along word of mouth. They don't have seminaries to train their leaders. They don't have anything. They don't have buildings. They're being persecuted. You can imagine it was exceedingly difficult to be a Christian in those days. People had to be confused. Can you go to the temple and worship the Caesar or not? And you had to be loads of people who said, well, it must be okay to do that. I mean, how bad could that really be? And it raises questions about what in our day we think, well, it can't be that bad, could it? We could try to fill in the blank for what those things are. The church at Sardis, I love this. You have the name of being alive, but you are dead, so you should wake up. I mean, how many churches seem to be, in our day, seem to be alive, but actually they're dead? They're not really attentive, awakened to God. And John says to them that Jesus says, I will come to you like a thief in the night. You've heard this thing about coming like a thief. The city of Sardis was perched on top of this hill and had tremendous defenses. So you can imagine that would be a very difficult city there to attack and to overwhelm. It fell twice in its entire history, and both times it was taken by stealth. Somebody sneaked into the city in the middle of the night. So John's picking up on that image. I will come like a thief by stealth. He uses the image of lions there. The archaeologists in Sardis have found this altar which has lions as an image. Now, the Romans used the lion as a symbol of might. We'll see what the book of Revelation does later with the lion as an image. The letter to Philadelphia. One of the things that John says to them is, God says, I will give you a new name. I will give you a new name. It's interesting because the city of Philadelphia was renamed twice within 50 years. It was called Philadelphia, and then, Caesar kind of got in a palate, needed a little more attention from them, so they decided to name their city Neo-Caesarea. That's a great name. And then they named the city again for Flavia, who was the wife of the next emperor. So the city was accustomed to new names. John says, I will give you a new name, but it will be a holy name. He says, there will be an open door. Philadelphia was the gateway to the east, where all the trade went in that direction. The city of Laodicea. This is so interesting. There's a church in Laodicea. Paul never went to Laodicea, but it was founded by a guy named Epaphras, whom Paul sent there. And we can read about this in Colossians. The church in Colossae met in the house of someone named Nympha, Colossians 4:15. Paul wrote a letter to the Laodiceans that we don't know anything about. It's mentioned in Colossians 4:16. John says to the Christians in Colossae, you are neither hot nor cold. You are lukewarm, and I will spew you out of my mouth. Have you ever heard this? What's really interesting is that Colossae is situated halfway between Hierapolis, where they had, Laodicea, is situated halfway between Hierapolis, where today they have these hot baths where people come for, we'll actually get in these, those of you who are traveling with me to Turkey. People come there for a healing, these hot salt baths, they're really wonderful. And Colossae, where they had a famous cold water supply, so there were pipes that ran from Hierapolis to Colossae, the hot water going to Colossae. Halfway is Laodicea. By the time it got there, in these pipes that are left over from the Roman world, the water was what? Lukewarm. It was a vivid image for the folks who lived there. In Laodicea, they were famous for their textiles. They made black wool there. They had a famous medical school there. They were a famous banking center in that area. So what does John say to them? John says to them, you say I am rich, to a banking community, kind of like Charlotte, not knowing that you are poor, blind, and naked. There's a medical school there, textiles there. He's picking up on their local imagery, what they were good at. They would say, we're not naked, we make the famous black wool here that everybody wants to buy. It says, buy gold from me, Jesus, buy gold from me, in other words, not from the bank, but from me, put on white garments, which for them were symbols of the purity and holiness of being a Christian. In those days when you were baptized, you would go down into the baptismal pool. When you would come up out of the pool, they would wrap you in a white robe. So to the people that made black textiles, he says, I want you to wear this white robe that represents a different kind of life, and salve to anoint your eyes, you people who are blind. What's interesting in Sardis is we know that there was a guy named Demosthenes Philalethes, very hard name to say. He was the world's most famous ophthalmologist. And he wrote a textbook on the eye, and there they produced this eye salve made of Phrygian powder. So when he says you're blind, but I will help you to see, it's a very local color there, right? Let's press on for time. Famous passage at the end of the letter to the 7 churches. Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. Well, this is sort of the end of what is sensible in the rest of the book. So G.K. Chesterton once wrote, although John saw many strange monsters in his vision, he saw no creature as wild as one of his commentators. That's kind of a funny line. In John, we see all these wild, bizarre creatures, but then people have said so many bizarre things about it that tops it. So you have, as I mentioned before, the late great Planet Earth came out in the 70s, and then drawing a beat on the year 2000, we had the Left Behind series that was enormously popular. Everybody thought that, when 2000 ticked in, that your computer wouldn't work, and that Jesus would come back, and people would be left behind. I gave a talk about this time, by the way. I was invited to speak to this interdenominational group of women on the book of Revelation and the book Left Behind. And so I came and I told them what I'm about to tell you about sort of the historical context and the symbolism of the book and what it means. And I thought it was a pretty good talk. And when I was done, the woman who had invited me to come and speak and had introduced me, she responded by saying, she said, I think it is so neat that you have your view and that Tim LaHaye, who wrote Left Behind, has his view. And I found myself saying, no, you don't understand. Tim LaHaye is wrong. And as I'll say it, there are ways that you can respect the views of others. And I have friends, they believe in all this, the Revelation is predicting the end of time. And I can respect them as people. However, it's important to say that they're wrong about that. They're wrong in their reading of the book. And I'll say a little more about why. This whole idea that we could read Revelation, it's going to tell us when the world is going to end, this didn't start with Howell in 1975, right? In 1843, there was a minister in Ohio named William Miller, and he read Revelation, all the other Daniel, other books of the Bible very carefully, and he was positive that the world would end on October the 22nd of 1843. Didn't know the exact hour, but he knew it would be that day. So all of his followers, they sold all their worldly goods. It's always interesting, right, that they sell their worldly goods, right? I would just give them away if you're, anyway. So I'm not making fun of it. So they went up on a mountain and they waited for Jesus to come back, and he didn't come back. Well, William Miller opened his Bible again and said, oh, I made a mistake. It's October 22nd, 1844. So a year later they came back and the same thing happened. This didn't start in 1843. In the Middle Ages, Joachim of Fiore, Martin Luther, all kinds of people read the Bible and said the world's going to end any moment now. And so what we wind up with over and over again is these prophecies failed. There was a sociologist who actually wrote a book about this. What happens when prophecy fails? What happens to people who believe Jesus is coming back soon and then he doesn't? And the answer is they very rarely give up their faith. There was something strong in them that made them believe in that. And so even though they got the timing wrong or whatever, they don't give up on God. They believe he's going to come back some other time. They just don't know when. Now, this whole image of the Bible as sort of a fortune-telling, a future, sort of an Edgar Cayce predicting the future is problematical. Because if you think about people in Bible times, they go back to the 7 churches, and they're facing extremely difficult situations. And the question that we have to ask is, what possible good would it do them, little struggling churches that are under duress, to have a book written for them predicting something that's going to happen 2,000 years later? Right? God's too good to give them that. God gives them something that will help them in their own day and age. So you heard at the beginning, Revelation says we're going to talk about things that will soon take place. It says, do not seal up the words. This is at the end of the book, for the time is near. So in Revelation, we have a book that is of immediate relevance to real Christians who are in peril. We're in the days of the early persecution of Christians. The Emperor Nero, this is toward the end of the life of Paul, probably during the time that John is a young man. The Emperor Nero in Rome begins persecuting not only Jews, but the early Christians. He very famously has Christians bound and burned to provide light in gardens and in the city at night. He begins this onslaught against Christianity. He has a successor named Domitian, who is the Roman emperor at about the time that the book of Revelation is written. And he becomes more systematic in his execution of Christians. And the kind of thing that happens over and over, we know from, if you've ever heard of Pliny the Elder, he was a Roman official in the empire during the time of the Emperor Trajan. And he and Trajan write letters back and forth and talk about how to handle Christians. They don't know what to do with them. So what Pliny says is that he would round up the Christians in every city, and he would show them statues of the emperor and of the gods, Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, all those Roman gods. And Pliny would demand a sacrificial offering, and that they had to verbally deny Christ. Like, make your offering to the emperor and deny Christ. Say that he's not your Lord. And some recanted, and they saved their lives, but many were not. And Pliny's observation in writing to the emperor was, he observed that real Christians could not be forced to do this, which I like. And so then Christians began to be executed around the empire. And it's interesting. Like, we tend to think this doesn't go on in the world today, but actually, there are places in the world today where Christians are, in fact, being persecuted. One of those text prayer requests that I got the other day that was interesting came from someone who said, my family, they're Coptic Christians that live in Egypt, and their lives are in danger all the time. If you are a Christian and you live in Syria, you very likely could lose your life for being a Christian in Syria. This is going on in the world today. Now, in Revelation, what we have is symbolism. And symbols are so clear to us. We know exactly what they mean. I showed you Nike a little bit ago. You know, there's that Nike swoosh. I'll never forget, I was with my father-in-law one time, and we saw an ad on TV, and just that Nike swoosh appeared on the screen. He said, "What is that?" And I said, "That's the Nike swoosh." And he said, "Why doesn't it say Nike?" And I said, "Everybody knows it's Nike." And he said, "I didn't know it." We're having this crazy conversation. We have symbols in our world that are self-evident to everyone except my father-in-law, right? So here you have the Nike swoosh, and it's omnipresent, and it's about big money, and it's about marketing, and everybody knows how to fall in line, right? Everybody buys Nike stuff. I could have put an apple up there. You know, you've got to have the apple. So this is about dominance in culture. You have the Wall Street bull. We know what that means. It's so interesting because the competing gods in the ancient world, the idols that were built to represent them were golden bulls. And here in New York City, today, we have a golden bull that says everything that we need to know about the importance of wealth and profits and commerce. Here's some interesting symbols. Now, let's say you didn't know anything about our culture, and let's say our culture had been destroyed, and people came 1,000 years later, and they're digging through things, and they find some placards, and they see this, and they think, what is that? And someone would say, donkey and elephant. And they would think, what would they think? They would think, these people love donkeys and elephant. They wouldn't know what to make of it. You and I know immediately what to make of this. This is Republicans and Democrats. You don't need anybody to explain it to you. Everybody knows what this is. When we read the book of Revelation, the symbols in Revelation were totally clear to the first people who heard them read aloud to them, as clear as the Nike swoosh and donkeys and elephants are to us. So in this book, we find common literary devices, and there's so many books. We have Daniel and Revelation, but there were lots of Jewish and early Christian books that didn't make it into the Bible that used the same manner of writing. They're in a collection of books called the Pseudepigrapha. One book in there is called Fourth Ezra. And we have this kind of language that we're going to see in Revelation. There came from the sea an eagle with 3 heads. What is that? He spoke, saying, I see 4 beasts. I mean, in Revelation, we have eagles with multiple heads. We have beasts. There's a book called Enoch. We read something like this, the blessing of Enoch, with which he blessed the elect in the day of tribulation. There's that word again. Other people suffer in tribulation. The holy God will tread on the earth. The hills shall melt like wax. A bull came forth and gored another. Then a star fell from heaven. Everyone in the early in the ancient world would have understood what the symbolism means. We see it and we think, a bull gored another. So we want to try to think what these symbols mean. There are symbols like animals. There are symbols like number. What does 7 mean? What does 144,000 mean? 144,000 in Revelation does not mean that you would count things, and when you got to 144,000, you would stop counting. It's a symbolic number that has something to do with the 12 tribes of Israel and their completion. 144,000 people will be saved. You and I may hope that's not a literal number. Because if you think about all Christians who lived in history, and there have been some pretty holy people, I bet nobody in this room would crack the top 144,000, right? It's a symbolic number. There are all kinds of symbols, and they show up over and over again. Deja vu. We read about Babylon in the book of Revelation, which is not a power during the time that the book of Revelation is written, but Rome is. And many people in the ancient world spoke of Rome as a new Babylon, common language. There are allusions to the Old Testament. If we knew our Bibles better, we would understand more of Revelation. Out of the 404 verses in the book of Revelation, there are 278 of them that are quotations from the Old Testament. Like, that's amazing, right? So if you had mastered the Old Testament, you'd totally get, right, 3/4 of Revelation. So the beginning, chapter 4 of Revelation, we begin to enter into these heavenly visions. And what we read is, I'll just read a little bit to you here. After this I looked, and lo, in heaven there was an open door. And the voice which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come hither, I will show you what must soon take place." At once I was in the Spirit, a throne stood in heaven. There appeared like jasper and carnelian. Around the throne was a rainbow that looked like an emerald. Have you ever seen a rainbow that looked like an emerald? It's not a rainbow that looks like an emerald. It's just language trying to capture the greatness of what this heavenly realm is like. John has a peek into heaven itself, and it's too great for words. It's beyond. So it's like a rainbow that is an emerald. Round the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the throne were elders clad in white garments with golden crowns upon their heads. This is just fabulous. From the throne issued flashes of lightning, voices and peals of thunder. Before the throne burned 7 torches of fire, which are the 7 spirits of God. Before the throne there's a sea of glass that is like crystal. Then there are all these other creatures, and what are they doing? They never stop singing in verse 8. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. We sing that in church sometimes, don't we? That's kind of my favorite hymn when I was a little boy. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. John has a glimpse of heaven, and what John tells us about heaven is that it is one endless worship service. You and I think about heaven, and you hear things like, I'm playing golf in heaven and making hole in one, right, or whatever. We kind of make heaven a continuation of life as we know it, but every indication of the Bible is that heaven will be worshiping God all the time. And we will, according to the Bible, want to do so because God will be so great, so beautiful, so awe-inspiring, nothing else will even seem to be interesting. So worship is something that happens now. The first people who heard Revelation heard it in a worship service, and what they hear is that this worship that we are doing now will be our destiny. This is what we will always be doing forever. And I'd add one other thing about that that I meant to mention, is that there should be something subversive about worship. We don't think of worship as being subversive. We think worship is kind of the way you fit in. It's the way you be a good American or whatever. But in the early church, if you gathered for worship and you said, Christ is Lord, you could lose your life for saying that. Why? Caesar was Lord. If you say that Jesus is God, then Caesar's henchmen would be unhappy with you because Caesar is God, and he's the one who should have you lose it. So it's a subversive thing to worship. We over and over see this Greek word dei, which means like. So there's a mystery to God. We can know God, yet there's limits to our understanding. It's always beyond that. Chapter 5, we begin to read this sequence. There is a scroll that has 7 seals. In those days, if I would send a letter to someone, I would have it dictated onto a scroll, and then I would have it sealed with my signet ring, right, into the wax that would seal it. So when it got there, you could tell it was actually from me, and it hadn't been opened or tampered with. It's sealed with 7 seals, and over the coming chapters, each one of those seals is broken, and part of the scroll is unfurled. And the question is, this is the key to the whole book, is who is worthy to open this scroll and to tell us about God? And in chapter 5, it's so interesting. Chapter 5, verse 5, one of the elders in heaven said to me, "Weep not, for lo, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered." Remember, the Romans used a lion as a symbol of their empire. The Jews had used the lion as a symbol of the tribe of Judah and the king of David, right? The Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered. Then between the throne and the 4 living creatures, I saw not a lion, but a lamb standing. John is transforming images of power into images of weakness and suffering. Everybody wants a leader, a Messiah who is like a lion, and instead what they get is a lamb. And the lamb became vulnerable, and the lamb suffered, and the lamb died, and we speak of Jesus as being the Lamb of God. It is the suffering Christ who can help us. It is the suffering Christ who can help people who are in a time of suffering. O Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world, have mercy on us. In chapter 6, we hear about these 4 horsemen, the alleged 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And there are all kinds of things that are described. A white horse comes out, and then there's a bright red horse that appears to be bloody. There's a black horse that has a balance in his hand. There's a pale horse. We hear this and we think, what can this mean? But it would have easily, for people then, reminded them of the Parthian invasions from the east who came in on horseback shooting arrows like no one else in the world did, frightening them. The Romans, bloodshed was everywhere. There was famine in the world in these days, hence the pale horse, the disease that comes in the wake of famine. There are disasters that are being unfurled, and what we have to realize is that there are disasters in the world as we know it, but for them, that mirrored disasters that were going on in a deeper spiritual realm. And it's hard for us to think about there being a spiritual realm beyond the physical realm that we know. And the only way I can try to begin to describe it, if you don't have a sense of that, is that sometimes people come to me and they say something like, this happened the other day. Someone said, I must have made a horrible mistake as a parent because my son drinks too much. And what we always do is we individualize things. We think this one person did something, they're an independent person, and why did they do it? But actually, if someone drinks too much, it's not because that one person made a bad decision. It's because we're caught up in the web of a much larger culture that glorifies drinking and alcohol and thinks you have to have all kinds of substances in order to feel good, to be happy, to have fun, or whatever, right? So it's not just an individual person. You're caught up in something that is much larger. John understands that there are deeper forces, that there's an eternal battle between good and evil. And what does this mean for these small Christians down here who are being persecuted? They're experiencing difficulties in their life, but it's part of a larger cosmic battle that God will win, which is the point of the story. So there are a series of 7 seals that are open, and then 7 trumpets blow, and then there are 7 bowls. And what we have to realize in this is it's not a sequential story, it's not a linear historical story, but it's cyclical. There's trouble, and then there's more trouble, and then there's more trouble, and the trouble seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. And maybe you actually experience the world that way yourself. The world has its troubles, and would you say the world is getting better as we proceed through time, or does it feel like we're in some cycle? Maybe it gets a little better for a while, but then it gets worse, and then it gets worse, and it gets harder, thinking about the troubles of the world and history. It's more kaleidoscopic than a literal story of what's happening. In chapter 12, I'm going to speed through the rest of this. I talked too long early. In chapter 12, we read about a woman who is clothed with the sun, and she has a crown of 12 stars, and she's suffering birth pangs. And then she gives birth to a son. The symbolism probably is that this woman represents the people of Israel. The 12 stars are the 12 tribes. And she's giving birth to some new life. For the early Christians, this would have been especially poignant because they would think of whom? Mary, as the ultimate Israelite woman who gives birth to this child who will be the deliverance of the people out of their time of trouble. Chapter 12, we see a key moment in the book. We hear that war broke out in heaven, and there's a battle between Michael and the angels and the archangels and the dragon who gets thrown down. Again, a mystical heavenly battle that mirrors the difficulties that are going on earth. But then in chapter 12, verse 10, there's a key passage that says, "Now have come salvation and the kingdom, but they have conquered by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony." They're describing here the Christians who have been faithful, who have not denied their faith. And the last line is the key. "For they did not cling to life, even in the face of death." This is a book that is written in praise of those who did not deny their faith and lost their lives and were martyred. One of the things that we could say is, how crazy is it to lose your life for Christ? But one of the things that we understand pretty clearly is that the reason Christianity actually grew and took root in the ancient world is that Christians took this thing seriously. They were willing to lose their lives for this. And over time, that didn't kill out Christianity. It made a big impression on others in the world around them. Then it raises all kinds of questions for us, where it's kind of so innocuous to be a Christian, and people look around on the street and they know who belongs to which church, and it doesn't mean much of anything to anybody. There's this high-stakes game, these early years of Christianity. And I want to touch on chapter 13 and then wind up the rest of the book pretty quickly here. So here we have a passage that gets talked about a lot. I saw a beast rising from the sea with 10 horns. This is a strange beast, and 7 heads, and on its heads were blasphemous names. Now, what is that? We'll look at that in a minute. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its wound was healed. The whole earth followed this beast. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is a person, and its number is 666. Now, if you read Tim LaHaye, if you read Howell, if you read any of these books, they take this material and they say, the 10 horns are the 10 nations in the European common market, or the 7 heads are something. And they take the 666 and it becomes Saddam Hussein, or, boy, somebody made it into Ronald Reagan. That was not a popular one in America, you can imagine. What does all of this mean? And from a historical perspective, it's totally clear what the beast with 10 horns and 7 heads with blasphemous names, and the one that had a wound that he recovered, and its number is 666. If we go to ancient Rome, in the days leading up to the time of the book being written, we know that there were emperors who called themselves God. Here is a coin from Caesar Augustus, and if you look on the left, it says, Divus Augustus, the divine Augustus. That's a blasphemous name from a Christian perspective. So there's a beast rising from the sea, 10 horns, 7 heads, blasphemous names. In Asia Minor, where these 7 cities were, the proconsul from Rome arrived literally from the sea. The Roman envoys would come from Rome. They would arrive on a ship with all of the regalia praising the emperor. At that time, there had been 10 Roman emperors from the time of Julius Caesar, the first of them. 7 of them had called themselves divine. The other 3 did not. So the 10-headed beast, pretty clearly, are the 10 Roman emperors. The 7 heads with the blasphemous names are the 7 who had called themselves divine at this time. So this beast represents the Roman Empire. It has a number, 666. In those days, people played a game with the alphabet called gematria. For instance, they found graffiti I'm trying to think how to translate it into modern terms. Let's say I had a crush on a girl named Abby, and I wanted to, kind of maybe let her know this or wonder about it. So I could say, I could write on a wall somewhere, James loves, instead of putting Abby, that'd be too obvious. So what I would do is I would do the math on her name. So A would be 1, and B would be 2, and the next B would be 2, and the Y would be 25, and you add those up, A, B, 3, 2, 5, 25, 30. So I would write, James loves number 30, right? And Josephine would walk by and say, I'm not 30. But Abby would walk by and go, oh, it could be me, right? So they were always attaching these numbers to people's names. So who could 666 be? Well, in the world, the way that Caesar, Nero Caesar's name would have been written, the N would be 50, the R would be 200, the 6, those numbers add up to 666. The average person on the street would have known that Nero's number was 666. And what's really cool about this is that's in Greek. When they translated the Bible into Latin 4 centuries later, they knew that this was the case. Because when they translated the number, they said the number is 616. Because in Latin, that's the way the math worked out. Pretty interesting. So we know that 666 stood for Nero. Well, by the time Revelation is written, Nero has died. So how can we be talking about Nero? And what we know is that when Domitian became the emperor, a rumor got out around the empire that Nero had come back from the dead. And we hear this and we think, oh, it's crazy. Like, we'd cover that on CNN immediately and prove that he's still in his grave. But you don't have CNN back then. You don't have anything. There's just this rumor that Nero, who was the most wicked of the persecutors of Christianity, has come back in the person of Domitian. And so all the coinage has the same number for him, and it comes out as 666. So everybody would have known in the ancient world that 666 represented Nero returned in the person of Domitian, who was the one who was persecuting Christians in Asia Minor. So things are terrible for the Christians, but the book of Revelation says in the battle that is going on in heaven simultaneously, God is winning, and we can trust that over time, God will win the battle. And so John actually gets a peek into what this victory is like. Fallen is Babylon, code for Rome the Great. As she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, so give her a like measure of torment and grief. You know, Revelation isn't a book that forgives its enemies. Revelation is a book of judgment and wrath on those who are evil. She will be burned with fire. Mighty is the Lord God who judges her. Chapter 19. After this, I heard the loud voice of a great multitude in heaven saying, Hallelujah, salvation and glory and power belong to our God, for his judgments are true and just. He has judged the great, lovely language here, not for children, the great whore who corrupted the earth and avenged on her the blood of his servants. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. You know, modern Christians don't like to think much about God's judgment. We tend to think that God is a very kind God, and God is a kind God. God is a gracious God. God's mercy is beyond any imagining that we have. But the Bible does portray a God that does judge what is hostile to God, what is alien to God, what pretends to be God and is not God. Finally, Revelation 19. I saw an angel standing in the sun. Again, the language is trying to grasp a vision of heaven that's too great for mere words. And with a loud voice, he called to the birds in mid-heaven, come gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings. This is disgusting. Captains, horses, and riders. The beast was captured, the false prophet. Those two were thrown alive into the lake that burns with sulfur. Then I saw an angel holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. He seized the dragon, who is the devil and Satan, bound him, threw into the pit, and locked it over him. I mean, this is a severe judgment that God is bringing upon evil, locking the devil up. But then for those who are saved, there's tremendous solace. And here's the kind of passage that we read at funerals. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and the holy city, the new Jerusalem, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne. See, the dwelling of God is among men. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more. Again, the Bible portrays not just a heaven that is some spiritual realm, but a new heaven and a new earth. What the Bible promises is the redemption of all of creation, the redemption of your body, the redemption of the world that is around us. So heaven isn't some disembodied, ethereal reality. It will be physical. All of God's creatures that God has created will be part of God's final, consummated, good kingdom. It raises some interesting questions, by the way, about animals in heaven. You know, people want to say, you know, is my dog in heaven? I'm pretty sure dogs are in heaven. Cats, I'm personally less sure. Kidding. I've told some of you this before. C.S. Lewis one time very famously was asked if there will be mosquitoes in heaven. And he said, well, there is a heaven for mosquitoes, and it's the same place that's hell for people. It's silly. If Revelation is an indication, there will be mosquitoes in heaven, but evidently they won't be harmful mosquitoes. The artist Edwin Hicks painted a number of paintings called The Peaceable Kingdom. And he tried to capture what these visions of Isaiah and John and others look like. There are all these animals that usually hate each other, you know, lions and snakes and bears, but they live peaceably together, and that's the hope for us. So God's reign of the New Jerusalem occupies the final chapters of the book, the 1,000-year reign. And it's, again, the language is too great. The city is a perfect cube. How could a city be a perfect cube? The gates of the city are pearls. That doesn't make a very good gate if it's a pearl. It's too wonderful for words, this description of what heaven is like. Then I love this. At the very end, John's written Revelation, all this vision to give strength and encouragement to the Christians, to help them understand that their plight isn't just this local thing, but they're part of this bigger cosmic drama. He concludes the book with this: I warn everyone who hears the words of this book, if anyone adds to them, God will add to that person the plagues described in this book. If anyone takes away from these words, God will take away that person's share in the tree of life. And this is amazing. In the early church, you don't have officially published Bibles. You just have a scroll that somebody wrote and it gets passed around. And the only way there's another copy is somebody makes a copy of it by hand. And one of the things that we know that is well documented is a lot of the early copyists would change little things to make it a little more palatable, to make it a little more easy, to make it. And so John's aware of this and he says, you dare not change. It's lovely, isn't it? Don't change a word of this. Revelation. So I'd sum this up by saying that Revelation has no interest in predicting political events that transpire in our age. It didn't hold in 1843, it didn't hold in 1975, it didn't hold in the year 2000. That does not mean that the book is not about us. It's as much about us as it's been about all of God's people in all time, who all live in a culture that is not of God. Sometimes we want to do this thing. We want to say, oh, there was a day when America was Christian. I just wonder about that. I mean, was there a day when America was really Christian in a robust sense, in a profound sense? The last person that told me this, he said, yeah, America was Christian back in the 50s. Well, as best I can tell, in the 50s, we did things like we lynched black people. We had segregated lunch counters. We did a lot of things in the 50s that maybe weren't all that godly. And we always live in a culture that is not of God. And it's almost as if the more thoroughly we try to live out our faith, the more at odds we are with that culture. And if you've tried to be a serious Christian, you find this. If you try to raise children who are Christian, you discover this. It's hard to be profoundly Christian in this world. It's easy to be an innocuous Christian in this world. Nobody minds, right? But if you take it seriously, then you're raising question marks about the culture. You don't participate fully in the culture. There are difficulties around that. We fortunately live in a day that there isn't physical persecution for us around any of that, but there is for some people in the world, and there has been. Places like communist China. In Russia, it's still a tough road to be a Christian. And always to understand that there's another reality beyond the simple reality that we see in front of us. There's a deeper realm, there's a spiritual reality, and there's a battle that's going on there. It's good versus evil all the time. And where are we going to be as part of that? How does that impact us? How are we participants in that deeper battle there that's always going on? You experience it in your soul, although you don't always know how to name it, right? It may be the anxiety that you feel. It may be a dark mood that you're in. It may be the simple, I think how to put this, the simple struggle to make sense of God in your life. Now, when you experience that, what do? If you do what I do is I kick myself. I say, I must be spiritually vapid because I'm struggling to get God. But it's never just me. And it's never just us. There's a deeper reality. We're part of this deeper battle. Of course, it's a struggle to make sense of God in this world because there are evil forces. And we live in a world that is not of God. And we live in a culture that in many ways is hostile to Christianity. And we have our own garden variety weirdness in ourselves that we share with all other people. So this book that says that God will ultimately triumph, that no matter how, we forget how evil can be. And we get glimpses of it now and then, and we're mortified. So the night they made the announcement of that there wouldn't be a case against the officer in Ferguson, Missouri, and we're glued to the TV and we see a firestorm erupting, and we're shocked by this. But in so many places in the world, that wouldn't be shocking. If you lived in South Sudan, that wouldn't be shocking. There are genocides in places in the world today. If you go back, we have people who live in Charlotte. They are Holocaust survivors. So during the Holocaust, they managed to get out, but they lost family members who were brutally executed by people who said that they were Lutherans and Roman Catholics. In Germany, unspeakable evil. And then if you think about the wars in our time, World War I, just terrible. I'm reading a book now about World War I, just hurling thousands and thousands of men just to be brutally killed. If you think about child abuse, I mean, there's just so much evil in the world, and you want to get cynical or you want to just make yourself safe or anything else. And this message that God will triumph over evil, that evil doesn't have the final word, that what is hostile to God and to the people of God, there will be a judgment. That's like the one thing that gives us hope. And we can have confidence in that. And if we have confidence in that, then we can suffer whatever we may need to suffer to be faithful to God. I'm rambling now and preaching just a little bit. So, all right, that's kind of what I went longer than I intended to. I apologize about that. I wanted to get done within an hour. A lot of material to cover, and I went through it kind of quickly. Let me ask this real quickly. If there are a couple questions anybody wants to ask or comments, anything? Yes, Jody? Say that again.
The inclusion of the book of Revelations in the Bible, wasn't there some controversy about including it or not? Or no?
You mean whether it should be included in the Bible? Surprisingly, not a lot. That gets said sometimes, but generally, the books that were debated that should it be in or not is like the letter of James. They weren't sure about James because James said you better behave and doesn't mention the grace of God saving you. So that kind of bothered the Paul people, right? 2 Peter sort of was up for debate a little bit with the book of Revelation, but on the whole, the early Christians loved it and wanted to hang on to it. And the reason is, through the whole 2nd century, when they're finally settling on which books are in the Bible, that is a time of intense persecution for Christians in most places. So this is the book for persecuted Christians par excellence, right? So it's almost always been in. Yeah, good question. What else? Yes?
Is there a book you recommend that we can read if we want to better understand Revelations?
There are a number of good ones, and I know Barbara has had some group studies. For instance, there's a guy who taught at Duke, and not because he's a Duke guy, because he's a great Bible teacher, named James Eford, E-F-I-R-D. He's written a lot of great Bible studies on a lot of books, but he wrote a little book on Revelation that's maybe 70, 80 pages long, really clear, really well done, that I would recommend. But there are a number that are excellent. We have some in our church library. Yes. But that's one that I'd recommend. Anything else? Thanks for taking your time on a Tuesday night to come out and talk about these things together. I appreciate you being here very much.